Morale is poor, Putin nightmare as army significantly degraded and power diminished. Vladimir Putin is facing a huge nightmare after the UK Ministry of Defense, MOD, warned morale is poor in many parts of the Russian army and its diplomatic power diminished. Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his country's war in Ukraine exactly 6 months to this day after tens of thousands of his troops had spent several weeks massing along the border with its eastern neighbor. The invasion has left a path of destruction throughout Ukraine, with many cities reduced to rubble after fierce fighting and heavy shelling in several towns and cities. But Putin has seen Russia struggle to gain control of many regions it had been hoping to fully occupy and has been forced backwards by courageous Ukrainian opposition, heroically led by President Volodymyr Zelensky. This has forced Russia to revert to more modest objectives in eastern and southern Ukraine, according to the MOD, while the offensive in the Donbass region is making minimal progress and Russia anticipates a major Ukrainian counterattack. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been killed in battle during the war, while thousands of military weapons and vehicles have also been wiped out. The devastating consequence for Putin is that morale is poor in several parts of Russia's military, the army is significantly degraded and its diplomatic power diminished. The MOD wrote in its latest intelligence update on Twitter, "Today marks the 31st anniversary of Ukraine's independence." Since 2014, President Putin has sought to use a mix of force and coercive diplomacy to increase and solidify Russia's influence in Ukraine and interfere in its sovereign affairs. Russia launched a full invasion of Ukraine 6 months ago, with the aim of toppling the government and occupying most of the country. By April, Russia's leaders realized this had failed, and reverted to more modest objectives in eastern and southern Ukraine. The Donbass offensive is making minimal progress and Russia anticipates a major Ukrainian counterattack. Operationally, Russia is suffering from shortages of munitions, vehicles and personnel. The intelligence update concluded, morale is poor in many parts of its military and its army is significantly degraded. Its diplomatic power has been diminished and its long-term economic outlook is bleak. 6 months in and Russia's war has proven both costly and strategically harmful. Russia has lost more than 45,000 personnel since the war began 6 months ago, according to the latest figures from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The latest numbers for the losses of Russian occupiers in Ukraine, posted on Twitter and citing reports from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, says there have been 45,550 eliminated personnel since February 24. Russia has also seen thousands of its own military vehicles wiped out during the intense fighting in Ukraine, dealing a further massive blow to Putin's plan to win the war. The new figures show Russia has lost 4,238 armored combat vehicles, 3,150 vehicles and fuel tanks, 1,921 tanks, 1,033 artillery, 817 drones, 266 multiple launch rocket systems and 234 military jets. In addition, 198 helicopters have been destroyed, as well as 196 cruise missiles, 146 air defense systems, 99 special equipment and 15 warships and boats. Putin exhausted Russian supplies as fatigued forces losing momentum in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has exhausted Russia's fatigued forces in Ukraine as the pace of the invasion effort slows, the head of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Agency has said. Kirilo Budanov described Moscow's resources in Ukraine as exhausted in a television address on Wednesday. He said, "Russia has rather seriously slowed down the tempo of its assault. The reason for this is the exhaustion of their resource base, as well as a moral and physical fatigue from the fighting." This comes as Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, insisted that Russia had deliberately put the brakes on its advance through Ukraine. He claimed Russian forces' efforts to avoid civilian deaths had reduced the speed of their progress. He said, "Everything is being done to avoid casualties among civilians. Of course, this slows down the pace of the offensive, but we are doing this deliberately." Russia has made gains in Ukraine, taking the southern Kherson region. But since pulling back from Kiev and its surrounding regions, the Russian forces have only made small gains in the eastern Donbass region. Russia said in March it was regrouping away from these recently targeted areas to focus on liberating Donetsk and Luhansk. A senior Russian military official said at the time, "The main objectives of the first stage of the operation have generally been accomplished." He added, "The combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine has been considerably reduced." He said this made it possible to focus our core efforts on achieving the main goal, the liberation of Donbass. The UK Ministry of Defence, MOD, has previously said that Russian morale highly likely remains especially troubled. The MOD added in June, cases of whole Russian units refusing orders and armed standoffs between officers and their troops continue to occur. The MOD then said various factors were driving such noticeable low morale within Russian forces. It described, drivers for low Russian morale include perceived poor leadership, limited opportunity for rotation of units out of combat, very heavy casualties, combat stress, continued poor logistics, and problems with pay. Months later, the MOD reiterated a similar message on Ukrainian Independence Day on Wednesday. It described Russia's failed offensive and how they reverted to more modest objectives in the east and south. It added, "The Donbass offensive is making minimal progress and Russia anticipates a major Ukrainian counterattack. Morale is poor in many parts of its military and its army is significantly degraded. Its diplomatic power has been diminished and its long-term economic outlook is bleak." 6 months in and Russia's war has proven both costly and strategically harmful. Putin humiliated as Ukraine to push exhausted Russians back to pre-war lines this year. Vladimir Putin is dealt a hammer blow as Ukrainian troops are poised to retake pre-war Ukraine if the West provides Ukraine with enough military equipment, a retired general says. Ukrainian troops could retake the Russian-controlled Ukrainian territories in a massive counteroffensive if the West provide Ukrainian troops with enough military equipment, U.S. retired General Ben Hodges says. Ukraine is bracing for potential buildup in Russian strikes, as the country celebrates Independence Day on August 24. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed a powerful response to any attacks by Russia. Mr. Hodge told Times Radio, "I think, to be honest, I think that if we are deliverable, which we were going to do, then it is a very real possibility that the Russians are going to crack. And then, we're going to see Ukraine pushing them back to the February 23 line by the end of this year." Without the right logistics, Mr. Hodges said, Russian soldiers could be put on the back foot by Ukrainian forces who could retake most of their country this year.